Here we are on episode number 43, 44, something like that, still not counting, on Unspeakable Bliss. And today I am joined by Caverly Morgan. Thank you for being here.
Thank
and my
you.
brother David, my Dharma brother David, who has also been on the podcast in a recent episode. So thank you both for being here.
Yeah, happy to be here with you, brother.
Thank you.
So here's the intro for Caverly. She is a meditation teacher, author, speaker, and nonprofit founder. She is the founder and lead contemplative of Peace in Schools, a nonprofit which created the nation's first 4-credit mindfulness class in public high schools. She is also the founder of Presence Collective, a community of cross-cultural contemplatives committed to personal and collective transformation, creating spaces for wisdom exchange and belonging. Caverly blends the original spirit of Zen with a modern non-dual approach. Her practice began in 1995 and has included 8 years, that's right, 8 years of training in a silent Zen monastery. She has been teaching contemplative practices since 2001. Caverly is the author of a kid's book about mindfulness. That's I believe that's the title, a kid's book about mindfulness. Her new book for adults, The Heart of Who We Are, Realizing Freedom Together Through Sounds True, is available on Amazon and Kindle, and we'll be speaking a lot about that today as well. Caverly speaks publicly at conferences on topics including contemplative practice, personal and collective transformation, social entrepreneurship, authentic leadership, and mindfulness education, and has been featured in publications such as Mindful Magazine as a cover subject and the New York Times. Caverly leads meditation retreats, workshops, and online classes internationally. She's been a teacher and presenter at the Science and Non-Duality Conference, 1440 Multiversity, Sangha Live, Esalen, the Mind, Body, and Life International Symposium for Contemplative Research, Buddha at the Gas Pump, Open Circle, the New York Zen Center of Contemplative Care, and many more. Prior to her pioneering efforts with Peace in Schools, Caverly worked for nonprofits serving people with special needs. An artist and educator, she brings insight, passion, warmth, and humor to her transformative work with students of all ages and experience levels. She is dedicated to actualizing possibility, serving love, and embodying the truth of our shared being. Caverly lives in Portland, Oregon, with her husband, Vinette. Am I saying his name right? Vinette? Vineet. And their 2 dogs, Sweet Pea and Dogan. Wow, we could just talk about your biography for the entire.
Oh, goodness. I did not know you were going to read that whole thing. But there you have it. Thank you. Yeah.
So offline, just before we began, I was sharing with Caverly how I came to find her work, and it was through a meeting of a mutual friend of ours, Rupert Spira, and I was asking Rupert about these teachings of non-duality specifically, and how I have this thought that if more people could access these understandings, these teachings, which probably is innate in a child to some degree, that we could avoid a lot of unnecessary suffering. I think all suffering is unnecessary. And I'm looking at like the Krishnamurti schools that he has, and somehow through that exploration, I found you and we messaged each other, and here we are.
Yeah, like I said, I appreciate so much the unfolding of the mystery. I've one of my favorite experiences in terms of this book making its way into the world is seeing whose hands it ends up in, how the person's touched. It's fascinating to see many people feel drawn to very different parts of the book. There's a lot in the book, as as I think you know, Christopher. I don't know if you've had a chance to peek at it, David, but it's there's a lot in it. So it's interesting to see where people connect.
Yeah, I have I only read a third of the way through it and then some summaries, and I have 53 citations, highlights in it already. So we're probably not going to get to all of them, but before I launch into some of the book, I wanted to ask you how and in what way, I don't know if it's a moment or throughout years of practice, but how did it become clear to you that if not one person is free, then no one is free?
Well, my answer to that is the end of the book, Christopher. So
Okay.
I'm going to be spoiling it.
Fair enough.
But one thing I can start by saying, which you've already felt this part of the book, and that is, and by the way, I'll be excited to have you check out the rest of it, because I know that the entry point that interests you the most are the non-dual teachings. And I very specifically wanted to write a book that supported people in moving from the progressive path to a more direct approach, but that honored all of the what I talk about in the book as the contemplative technologies that have supported me in my own background training as useful supports as we rest in direct experience of who we are. So you and I'll have to have a follow-up conversation once you've had a chance to experience that, the fullness of that arc. But to speak to your question, these contemplative technologies that I experienced as a monastic, I realized early on that I was applying them to my personal life. I was applying these tools to the experience of ending my suffering. And it wasn't until after I was a monastic that I was confronted by the realities of the relative plane world in a very different way than I was confronted or not confronted as a monastic. And in that experience, I began to recognize the value of being able to apply these same tools, but rather than merely personally, also collectively. So the experience of seeing, for example, how the personal ego is not actually separate from the collective ego began to inform not only how I approach my own experience of practice and being, but how my experience of being in community and part of a collective is also impacted.
So something I really loved about the book is this, what do you call my way-seeking story? What is our way-seeking story? And I want to share at least a piece of mine with you, because we have so much in common. I mean, I know that because I read your book, and now we're just getting to know each other here, and David as well. So I want to share that. And by the way, some pieces of this dialogue, I don't necessarily have questions. I'm just sharing, and I'm very open to anything that comes up from either of you at any point in the dialogue. So I was studying accounting in college, but it was my choice, but I was just running the kind of narrative of, this is the thing that you do because this is what's going to make you the most amount of money, and this is what everybody else wants you to do, or at least that's what I thought. And fortunately, I went to a liberal arts school, a true liberal arts school at the time, and they offered philosophy and acting. acting as well. And I'm pointing to Caverly here because I read in her book, she at some point, I believe, moved to New York City and was pursuing a career as an actress too. So I thought that was a nice synchronicity. And anyway, studying philosophy and acting was the first time that I feel that I followed my heart. Like this is something that's coming from in me. I didn't consult anyone else. Which was a big decision as a probably 20-year-old. I was in my sophomore year, and I'm like, I'm gonna do this, and I'm not gonna ask for permission. I'm not even gonna ask my mom and dad, and I'm just gonna do this thing and see where it goes. And as a result of play for the sake of play, that made sense to me, and philosophy, which my professor, he described it to me as, if you want a happy life, then study philosophy. And I'm like, all right, that's where my student loans are going. I'm sold. And it led to a young man in the class sitting next to me. He said, you're saying a lot of stuff that's in this book that I'm reading, which is a kind of a strange thing to say. And he showed me the book, and it had this yogi on the front cover with long hair. And it's this book called Autobiography of a Yogi. And I was like, yoga, I don't know anything about yoga. And this guy kind of looks like a woman. I don't know about this, but it kind of felt like this curious openness, and I followed it. And ever since I read that book, my passion has been sharing these understandings. So I just wanted to share my way-seeking story, and how what I really feel the key for me was when I actually followed my intuitive heart's calling. That has never led me astray, and I don't think I'd be here today if I didn't heed that call to some degree.
That the listening to that call is what guided you to this moment. Yeah. It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Let's talk about dogs.
Oh, all right. Always happy to talk about dogs.
Yeah, so I'm actually curious, in your book, when you talk about your dog that left his body, Banky, is that right?
Bankei, named after the Zen master.
Bankei. When did that happen? What?
When did Bankei die?
Yeah, timeline for that.
Oh gosh, timeline. A couple years ago now, actually closer to 4. Closer to 4 years ago, yeah.
Okay, so I've always just had such a love for dogs. They're just like such a sweet place in my heart, and a similar. I almost couldn't believe what I was reading as I was reading your story, because my dog Gemma, I was away on a trip in Bulgaria, and she was at my parents' house in Cleveland, in Ohio, and they took her in for a checkup because she couldn't walk, and her back leg had collapsed. And then next thing you know, after they do the scan, they find out that it's some kind of malignant bone cancer. And I was just on a phone call with my dad, and I said, how's Gemma? And then he told me what had happened. And within 24 hours, it was like almost the same, very similar story. That's why I was asking, because that happened in August of 2021 for me. And I pulled up one of my, you don't know this, Caverly, but I have a book that I wrote too. And I kind of took the artistic path where I am just speaking about oneness in a way through contemplative poems. And I wrote one, and I wanted to share it here with you and with David, because it's in honor of this love for Gemma, and I imagine that maybe you'll be able to relate to it, and anyone that's going through suffering, a grieving process. So it's rather short, but I wanted to share it to honor our precious four-legged friends and anyone else grieving. So it's called Love Loss. Your death awakens our inseparability. My heart rips, flooded with your love. My tears, empty contentment, full of sadness. I trust you occupy the formless space of my heart. I can't hold you, so my arms stretch wider. I can't see you, so I look closer. I can't hear you, so I listen deeper. I can't share my love with your form, so I love your formlessness infinitely more.
So beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Chris. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, it really speaks to how confused sometimes we get by the form. Points to your direct experience of love. It's lovely.
I think this could be a good time to talk about this magic ingredient of love that you reference a lot of time in the book as well, which is I don't know about you both, but it seems like it always comes back to that. It's like, oh, this is love, and this is about sharing love with freely with as many as I can.
Mhm. Yes.
I'm curious about that in a, yeah, I guess I'd be curious to hear kind of your perspective on that, having come from a monastic background and then have come back into the world. And I know, for me, I have a lot of experience sitting in like a Goenka Vipassana, so that particular style. And you think about, a very specific brand of love, but also the monasticism has this kind of a bit of an austere quality to it at times. So I'm be just curious to hear about what that means to you, like what love means to you, and maybe how that's changed as you've entered into different phases of your life and your relationship to the practice.
David, thank you. I think that's a great question. Well, certainly I grew up believing that love was inherently conditional. So love had something to do with my behavior. Love had something to do with whether or not I deserved it. I vacillated between feeling worthy of love and unworthy of love just based on circumstance. So love also was very connected to externals in general. So not just whether or not I deserved it, but kind of who was around me and what they wanted to dole out and how I might control my behavior to get as much of what they were willing to dole out as possible. And I didn't grow up in an environment where I had a lot of direct experience with unconditional love. And I think in a lot of ways, one thing meditation practice began to offer was touching in on something very deep that I wasn't experiencing in what in the book I talk about as, I wasn't experiencing it in the relative plane. So, and by relative, I just mean that it's the plane where everything's coming and going and changing forms or, coming and going and changing. And the world of identity. And I didn't, in that world, that's where love was something to seek. And meditation practice offered an experience of love that had nothing to do with causes and conditions. It had nothing to do with grasping. It had nothing to do with striving. It felt like one way that I could talk about the absolute, or that which isn't changing, that which isn't coming and going. And so as a monastic, I watched myself bounce back and forth between an experience of being completely identified with the relative plane, continuing this process of looking for love in all the wrong places, but not being able to get as far with it in a monastic context. I mean, if, in that environment, you hit a brick wall hard and fast, because we weren't, as monastics, we weren't even making eye contact with each other. So, it's not as though I could have the validation that I was accustomed to having just enough of, that I would then go and seek more of it. So one thing that the monastic structure did is it required me to turn somewhere different for the thing that I longed for. And to not be able to run this racket that I'll find it if or when, that it's based on externals, and that it's conditional, and that I'm therefore needing to shapeshift in every moment in order to receive the very thing I most long for.
So interesting to hear. And, I think very much of, I feel like the Zen masters are kind of famous for their hardness, their sharpness, their discipline, also their absurdity and their joy, and, many, many things. But I imagine like a Zen monastery as this very disciplined environment. But it makes a lot of sense the way that you speak about it. It's almost like they're kind of cutting off all of your avenues for chasing love in the relative, in order to kind of redirect you towards that absolute source of love that is not dependent on causes and conditions and relationships and temporary things. So that's really fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. And don't get me wrong, it's an environment that was all about discipline. I mean, this is just what I think anyone experiences, perhaps you both as well, just through our practices, that as we rest into direct experience of who we truly are, and to reference my own book title, the heart of who we truly are, we recognize that there are moments where perhaps discipline has supported us and helped us, but that the direct experience of knowing our being isn't contingent on our ability to be disciplined all the time.
Well, thanks for putting in the hard work for us at the monastery.
Well, it sounds like you both have been very diligent about your pathways and practices as well, and that's what we do when love draws us.
Yeah, I love this quote that you have here in the book that relates to this. You say, my hope, this is actually from the introduction, my hope is that it doesn't feed the story that if you could only fill in the blank, you could finally be free, rather than starting with the assumption that you need to work hard to become free. We begin with the focus of what is already free, already and always. And there it is.
Yeah, and then we get hooked, right? So we recognize ourselves as this inherent freedom, and then there are all these places that we do get caught in our and our
Mhm.
storylines. We get confused about what's so, don't we? And so then how wonderful that we have all these tools, practices, supports that to me really serve as reminders, not as openings for striving or efforting.
Mhm.
But and that's why in the book I refer to return. Each chapter says return to something, whether it's truth or love or being or it's about remembrance for me.
Caverly, I'm curious how you think about or relate to this idea that I heard from Ram Dass, where he says karma yoga, the yoga of being in relationship, which I mean, I know we're in relationship even in a monastery. I mean, we're relating to each other. I've not been in a monastery, but if we're doing something together, we're in some kind of relationship. And yeah, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this karma yoga being I think I've heard him say it's the hardest path, but it's also one that can be the most rewarding or something like that.
Well, one thing I'll acknowledge about that is the older I get, the more I feel able to trust life. I see so clearly that not everyone needs the same thing. And so I, as a deep extrovert, needed a break from the kinds of relationships that I was inside, within, tangled within in some cases. I needed a structure that required me not to prioritize those so that I could have a different experience of practice. And I don't know at that point in time if I would have learned the things I learned about myself and about practice if I hadn't had a structure like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I do not feel that that's the right structure for everyone. I feel very strongly that for some people, a path that looks very different on the outside is the most healing, medicinal path possible for that person. So my husband, Vineet, he's since I think he was about 24, has been with Amma. And you all, based on your experience of being in India a lot, might be familiar with Amma. Are you familiar with Amma?
Yeah.
Didn't meet her, but heard a lot about her while we were down there.
Yeah. So he, when we met, I got this incredible taste. I had been to India before, and in fact lived in an ashram before I was a monastic, the Sri Aurobindo ashram in Delhi. But my husband had lived for quite some time at Arunachala, Amma's ashram down in Kerala. And so when we got together, picture like gray, black, white, Zen, monastic, shaved head for many years, celibate monk as all part of my history, meeting this man who's coming from the mother's embrace, rose flower petals, chanting, devotional bhajans, bhakti path. I mean, it's like our doorways in couldn't have been more dramatically different. But to know that I got exactly what I needed from the experience I had, and that Vineet has gotten exactly what he's needed from the experience he's had, has again not only built my trust in life, but my reverence for the mystery of this grand unfolding. So I think it's important to leave a lot of room for what we're each here to learn and what we each need.
It's really fascinating to look at everyone's different entry points into their own pathway. And I feel like for me, it has this aspect of balance. And for me, what I recognized after spending a lot of time in like the Goenka Vipassana tradition, I recognized that the part of me that was actually attracted to that tradition was the part of me that needed balancing out. It was kind of this like self-isolating, escapist, wanting to be alone and disconnected from the world, that was attracted to 10 days silent Vipassana meditation. Nobody talks to each other, nobody looks at each other. And it was only after that, after going to India and kind of like slowly allowing my heart to open, that I actually started to find that like most of the juice of my spiritual path has been like coming together to sing kirtan with a group of people and really feeling our hearts vibrate together, or having like a deep, meaningful relationship with like a dear spiritual brother. I've been really appreciating Christopher these last few days as we've been hanging out with one another. But I just find it interesting that it seems like it's kind of this balancing act as we choose our own pathway. And it sounds like maybe, Caverly, for you, you were needing to balance out your extroversion and your tendency to kind of lean into or maybe grasp onto relationships a bit more. And I'd be curious about, like, for Vineet, was he more like kind of reserved and needed to kind of like open up into the bliss of the mother?
Well, certainly he would describe himself as a deep introvert, and he was thrown into a spiritual community that had him intensely within the context of relationship with others and working a lot. I mean, a huge part of, Vineet's spiritual experience within that structured context of an ashram had to do with his seva, his service projects in the community. And as a monastic, I worked a lot too. That was, as a monastic in the tradition I was in, there was sitting meditation, walking meditation, eating meditation, and then working meditation. And that's pretty much it. There was group discussion a couple times a week about your practice and some private meetings with the teacher, but work was a huge part of it. But again, very different entry points for how to approach the experience. And as you rightly reflect back, David, my training was much more about letting go of all externals and letting go of all distractions and turning the attention inward as fully as possible. And Vineet's experience was certainly more along the Kashmir Shaivism kind of approach of turning toward and moving in, which is a movement I make in the book too. And part of the reason I make the movements I make in the book is to offer as many entry points for the reader as he, she, they might find. So I wanted it to be the case that for the person who's looking for some structure, they actually have structure there that can be held onto and practiced with and supportive. And for the person who's had tons of structure, it's likely that they're going to feel the light of the releasing of that structure that the book offers. I speak in the book about how meeting Rupert Spira shifted how I practice and how I offer practice to others, because one of the first things that began to dissolve as I sat with Rupert was how much I had been focusing on discipline. And again, that really served me, but it was very important for me to be in a context where some of the conditioning I had around that got to be revealed and then therefore, dissolve. So yeah, that's my intention with having so many different entry points, practices, pathways come together, is not to hopefully confuse the reader, but to allow for different connection points based on what the reader most needs. And often we don't know consciously what we most need until we happen to be sitting there and we hear that note in the verse or the chorus, and we realize like that's so beautiful. I hadn't even been looking for that, but that connects, that means something to me. I want to follow that.
That's beautiful, and that kind of answers a little bit the question I was going to ask you as well. Like, what would you advise to a reader about kind of how to tune into, or how to really hear the message of which of these approaches or pathways is resonating truly for them? Just from my experience of like recognizing later on, years down the road, I was like, oh, it was actually kind of a wounded, introverted part of myself that chose this silent Vipassana path. And maybe there was another part of my being that would have resonated more with something a little bit more outward. But what would you recommend to somebody?
Well, I have such an appreciation of a man named Walter McKitchen, who is no longer with us on this realm, but he was the founder of the Center for Self-Teaching. And one thing that I'm pleased that I was able to pull off in this book is constantly reflecting to the reader's adequacy to find what they most need, to have the book be an opportunity to listen deeply at where there's resonance. And I think it's important that the book begins by supporting the reader in understanding our own conditioning, personal and collective. So what are the habits and stories that we've been indoctrinated into and just assumed to be ours? How have we been conditioned by society, culture, all the variables around us on this relative plane? The important thing to me about that in this book is that it lets us have the kind of discernment that, David, I think you're describing. You can see that a part of you was called to one particular approach for a particular reason, but that you can step back and recognize, oh, that's that part of me, and that's what the pull was. That might not be the kind of pull, or if I'm referring to the part of me for something, that might not be the part of me I'd want driving the car all the time. Right? Does that land?
Yep, absolutely. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's beneficial to know these different parts of ourselves and the conditioning that we've absorbed, so that we can discern what's arising on behalf of the ego, and what's arising on behalf of that which is beyond the ego. Mm-hmm.
I would like to ask and talk about the question that I've been kind of wrestling with over the past month or so, and the question that led to us talking today, Caverly. And it's something like, let's take Carl Jung's idea of full individuation or full ego development, to the point where someone is uniquely expressing themselves in the way that only they can express themselves. And then the idea of that same person knowingly, through experience, not just mentally, knowingly being connected to everything or everyone, the all that is, I could say. And the question that I'm looking at, David and I kind of came to a hypothetical answer of what we were thinking about in relationship to this. And it has to do with conditioning, which is there a way, I'm asking, contemplating, that young people, really young, I'm talking 0 to 7, and I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess from birth, is there a way, is becoming a separate individual necessary and inherently traumatic, or is there a way that we could be sharing these understandings with someone where they get all the benefits of being individuated and becoming their unique self, but simultaneously, if the example I gave with David, I said, if there's like 2 fully enlightened masters as their parents, and then there's a community of those, that in a way they could become individuated, but then also, because of their cultural teachers being connected to the truth of who they are, that then it's avoiding, and avoiding is not quite the right thing, but the trauma and the suffering, it's ahimsa, it's the least amount possible for that person's upbringing. So I know that's kind of like convoluted and there's not like one exact question, but this is something that I'm attempting to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I really hear that at the heart of your question, you're asking, is it possible for us to raise our children in an environment where they get to be vibrant, full expressions of who they truly are, versus having to go through the kinds of things that the 3 of us have likely gone through to get to where we are today, which is a lot of, I mean, sorry to project, but you can tell me if you 2 have never experienced any suffering. But you know, for the average adult, we experience ourselves as separate. We suffer. We look for ways to end suffering. It's, you know, the journey of a spiritual pathway is the journey of following the call or the longing to be reunited with, again, to reference the book title, with the heart of who we are, the truth of who we are, right? So what would it look like to be, as parents or community members for our children, constantly reflecting who others truly are back to them, rather than supporting them in downloading like illusory forms of identity. And so that requires us as adults to not take our eye off who someone really is. And so we have to be established in knowing our own true nature for this social experiment that you described to be manifest. And then absolutely, it's not only do I think it's possible, I've directly experienced how young people can thrive differently when they're surrounded by adults who have a first and foremost commitment to reflect the truth of who we really are to that student. I mean, I've seen it in Peace in Schools. We're not using any religious language in Peace in Schools, and that's important to me. It's not just code for, it's not like we're hiding that we're actually a really religious organization, where it's not that at all. Who we truly are has nothing to do with religion, actually. And so to reflect someone's authenticity back to them, it ends up touching a student, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Christian, whether they might define themselves as an atheist. And I can just report firsthand that that's the container, that's the context in which students can really thrive. Again, it's what I see in the nonprofit Peace in Schools that I am still part of and founded.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I actually have a quote here from I looked at the 2022 to 2026 strategic
Mm.
plan for peace in schools just before we had our call, and I want to share this quote from a student that was participating in the mindfulness studies. This semester, my great grandma died, a friend committed suicide, my parents got divorced, and my mom got breast cancer. This class gave me skills to be able to move through this.
Yeah, it's really I remember the student who said that. I was the one that jotted that quote down. I'm happy to report that we're now big enough as an organization that I'm seeing quotes come through all the time, and I wasn't in the room for them, but that's one that I had jotted down, and I remember this student quite well because that student's an example of someone who didn't just benefit from having new skills. This student really flowered in an environment of care, and care in the container that we've created with Peace in Schools stands for confidentiality, acceptance, reverence, and empathy. Which, if you've been in high school lately, reverence as part of a guideline for a classroom is a pretty radical thing. And this student was one of the many students that could really open and sink into being comfortable in their own skin, and then a quick trip from that to their own being, just based on the environment. So the student underlines these skills, but because I can remember the students so clearly, it's touching to me to remember that the skills were useful, and the skills inside that container is what was really transformational. And part of that container goes back to the very thing that you all are bringing up, which is what shifts when the container reflects the heart of who we are, when the teachers are reflecting the heart of who we are, when the students are beginning to reflect for each other, to each other, the recognition of the heart of who we are. It's that's where collective transformation thrives.
Mm-hmm.
That's so beautiful to hear, Caverly, and it just kind of it brings to mind for me, and I want to ask you as well, in your experience, what do you find to be maybe the most powerful areas to attend to when you are consciously creating the container for a community that is supportive of this level of flowering for beings? And I ask kind of in the context of Christopher and I have been exploring this a lot lately as we're feeling really inspired to create a community that we want to be a part of, because we recognize for ourselves how nourishing it is to be in that safe container that allows for that flourishing. So I'm just be really curious to hear any advice or areas to attend to in creating that container.
You know, it's interesting. The first thing that comes up is the importance of being able to work with the bumps and the rubs along the way. So what I mean by that is, especially in spiritual communities, I see so much beautiful, open-hearted intention that has missed structural support to help us deal with the things that arise that are part of being a conditioned human being. And therefore, the beautiful intention gets colored by what there's not support to tend to, egoic forms that arise. So it's one of the reasons I feel so strongly, even though the experiences I've had resting in presence in non-dual retreat settings, it's just completely delicious. And one of the things I've seen in those settings and in even like non-dual conferences is, in some cases, a lack of attention to how to work with what's arising on behalf of the ego instead of arising on behalf of the heart of who we truly are. And so if you want to create a community that can truly be sustainable, I think it's a requirement to know how to address what arises on behalf of the personal ego, on behalf of the collective ego, and how to have really grounded, I talk about the bumps and the rubs because it's bound to happen. If you're gonna have more than one person, you're going to be dealing with someone's conditioning, meeting someone's conditioning. And so it's, I think it's really important to put supports in place from the beginning. So you're not waiting for the shit to hit the fan to decide, okay, now how do we want to deal with what's happening? If you create intention from the beginning that suggests that bumps and rubs will happen because we're conditioned human beings, and here are the supports we have in place, here are the tools that we collectively share. For example, think of how different a high school classroom is, in which every student understands what projection is. You have a really different conversation about what's arising when people can discuss and own what they're projecting. If that's not a tool that's on the table, if all the community knows together is the deliciousness of singing in harmony in a bhajan or kirtan, you'll not know how to move through these bumps and rubs in a way that returns the community to the very reason the community formed.
Yeah, right. So on point, and I feel like that is really the heart of what I see missing in a lot of intentional communities, spiritual communities, or just groups of friends, just people coming together. And I wonder, are there any like specific tools that you found to be really helpful for doing this? I'm imagining like nonviolent communication as one, as you mentioned, being aware of just some of these kind of basic psychological concepts like projection or shadow stuff, but what have you found is useful?
Well, I promise I don't mean for this conversation to sound like a sales pitch from my book, because it's kind of starting to, but I think it's just so alive for me because it's out in the world now, and this is the thing that people often want to talk to me about. But I do feel that one of the things that excites me about this book is that it takes these personal tools and it applies them to groups. And so one thing that's really exciting for me right now is having groups of people start to report to me what it's like for a group to work with the practices in the book. So for example, a lot of spiritual communities that I have come upon aren't paying attention to collective conditioning, societal conditioning, in terms of what is the makeup of this group. Are there just white-bodied people in the group? Is this a mixed race group? If so, there are going to be particular things that are going to come up that might not come up if it's just a group of white folks. Is there anyone who's part of the group that feels marginalized by dominant culture in any way? What kinds of supports from the recognition that we're all one are there for this relative plane experience where we're not treating each other like we're all one? I can't tell you how many people I speak to who feel very marginalized by dominant culture that walk into yoga studios and, everybody's talking about how we're all one, and it's not their lived experience. So what kinds of supports are in place so that we can be addressing what's ours to address, including the blind spots of those founding this experience, including all the things that we're not seeing because we're of a certain position, maybe a certain come from a certain set of privileges. That, you know, it's one thing if you're trying to create a community only for privileged people, and I actually happen to know, Christopher, based on how you started this and how you reached out to me, that's not actually that interesting to you.
Mhm.
You know, just sort of preaching to the choir
Right.
is maybe delicious to a part of you, but I hear that you have a calling for something beyond that. And so what I'm pointing to is what I in my own experience have found is required if you have that calling to move beyond that setting.
Yeah, I mean, I want to personally reflect that that's I have a one-on-one coaching meditation practice and work one-on-one and in small groups with people. And it's great and I love it. And I do reach to a degree, a very small degree. It feels like this kind of subset of people that have the resources and I mean, now I can even add in the algorithms on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube are optimizing. And guess what? Like the things that they're searching for, someone that does live in a marginalized community, they're not gonna, their algorithm looks completely different, and it's not going to be. It just feels, yeah, it feels like restrictive, and I want to break through that and find out ways to share this more with those that I mean, we all need it most, and that's the whole point of this is I have a deep desire to, like at the beginning of the conversation, if I'm living in a world where it seems like not everyone's free, well, how free am I? How free are you? How free is anyone? And so just a side note, I do want to say this is a sales pitch for Caverly's book. Please, everyone, get your hands on a copy of this, because I have yet to read a book that feels as comprehensive to the truth of who and what I experience myself to be, as well as, I mean, you're getting your hands into the system, which is like, thank you so much for what has led you to do that, because to me that I'm like, oh yeah, that's where this can really, that's true change. That's a whole cultural revolution of sorts. So it's just so grateful to be here talking to you, talking with both of you, speaking with both of you. And I wanted to ask you then, as you just were sharing, if we have the systems in place from the beginning, something like this you were saying in response to David. And well, actually, one of my clients is a grade school teacher, and she teaches iRest. It's
Oh yeah, Richard Miller. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just for the listeners, and David, I know I've mentioned it to you, it's a secular mindfulness training developed by the military for, I believe, grade school student. I don't know what grade they start at and then what grade they go to, but in a way I was thinking of it as almost like a preliminary to the Peace in Schools project that you have. And so the two things I'm curious about, the first is there a nationwide plan for Peace in Schools? I saw its plan is for the Bay Area and Oregon. And then also, what are your thoughts on bringing practices and things like this to the younger and younger people who are in public and private education?
Yeah, thank you. So first, I think iRest, if it's the iRest that I'm thinking of, I think it was developed by Richard Miller,
I
and
think that's it.
yeah, he may have brought that to those. I believe one of the first places he started teaching was and sharing this practice was with vets.
Mhm.
But I don't think it was developed by the military, just sort of a
Oh,
little,
okay.
yeah, I'm pretty sure it was, developed by a contemplative who decided to go into these settings. And the reason I want to underline that is because I relate so much to this experience of being a contemplative that out of love and care for the world wants to share what's been supportive to me while continuing to be supported in deepening my own practice. I mean, it really goes both directions, doesn't it? I mean, if you want to stay accountable to your heart's intention, put yourself in community and have other people require it of you. So, but regarding Peace in Schools, we are in the middle of an exciting time of expansion. And what is happening specifically is that we've learned that the model we created is not very scalable. So we're in 8 schools with our semester-long mindfulness course now in Portland, Oregon. And it's quite exciting because it's the first program in the country that has expanded as much as we have, like to be in 8 schools and to have a curriculum that allows us to be with students for over 70 hours. So each student gets over 70 hours of immersion into the practice that we offer and the arc of this curriculum. And many students take the class more than once. So it's an incredibly deep experience. We cover the conditioned mind, the nature of the conditioned mind, duality, how we perceive reality through a dualistic lens, how we're habituated to do that, what it means to disidentify from the conditioned mind, how to recognize our own negative self-talk and disidentify from that self-talk, and how to ask big, important questions like, who am I? And what does it mean to truly belong? So I'm passionate about this course because of that depth and because of the transformation I've seen take place, because it's not just a sprinkling of a few tools like counting the breath or learning to calm down. And that depth is something that's very stimulating to me. But we have realized that in the Portland model, we have a contemplative that works for Peace in Schools that is paired with a co-teacher who's the Portland Public School employee. And that's because the people that we're hiring through Peace in Schools aren't necessarily trained high school teachers. I mean, you all could be trained to facilitate the Peace in Schools curriculum. And I'm assuming you don't have a master's in education to be working in a high school. So that's been beautiful because it's allowed us to build the curriculum and really spend time making sure that our curriculum is culturally responsive and trauma informed, and having lots of different perspectives come into the original curriculum that I've created. But to scale, we've realized that we're going to need to give a very strong college try at flipping our model, which means training the educators to offer this curriculum. So that's what we're doing with some schools in Oregon and some schools in the Bay. I just actually left the Bay Area and was meeting with folks who were part of a big strategic planning process and some really key donors who are excited to see this project take the next step. And so we'll see if we can show through a 3 to 4 year pilot program, which we're designing now, that we can flip who we're training. And the way we're doing that is to find principal and teacher pairs that are passionate about this work and that are ready to say, we want this full semester-long course in this high school. So the teacher is willing to teach it and the principal is willing to go to bat for it. So we're only working with schools where that combination is in place. But if we can pull that off, which I believe that we can, then we can talk about what national scaling actually looks like, because over these next handful of years, we can be cultivating the training program that allows these teachers to have the supports in place to teach this curriculum.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And what are your thoughts on educating younger people than high school age with things related to what we're sharing and talking about here?
You know, I'm a huge fan of supporting anyone and everyone in being able to ask the question, who am I really?
Mhm.
And offering all the tools and contemplative technologies that support what happens as you ask that question, right? Like all the different things that come up and the kinds of tools and practices we were referring to just a bit ago when talking about conscious community. And I've really wanted to be careful with peace in schools regarding mission creep. There are a lot of wonderful mindfulness programs out there. I mean, we have so many friends and beloved colleagues out there offering various forms of practice and mindfulness to younger people. I've wanted to just stay focused on this semester-long curriculum that cognitively you have to be well, you don't have to be. We've had some students come to the class a little earlier than we would necessarily choose, but counselors have said this student's ready for it, they really want it, and we allow them in. But ideally, the curriculum is actually for 10th through 12th graders, or at some point we might go into college. But that's juicy to me because that means you're old enough to really understand that identity is forming right before your very eyes regarding, you know, if you're a teenager, you're downloading these notions of who I'm supposed to be and what life apparently is so fully, and to be questioning it at the same time, rather than, as we were talking about before, like circling back around to it years later, you know, after you've had a divorce or a conscious community fall apart because there was like community drama that no one knew how to deal with, or, you know, whatever, like, you know, to have that as it's forming is something that lights me up a lot. And I really hope over time that more and more supports are offered at even younger ages.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's so fascinating to hear, and it kind of brings to mind for me, as you were speaking about the rigor and the depth of the program that you've put together. It was kind of bringing to mind a lot of the exploration that I've heard people like Daniel Ingram go into around, you know, meditation at high doses can be destabilizing. And, you know, I imagine 70 hours spread over the course of a semester, you know, wouldn't really be high dosage from like a monastic perspective. But certainly as we approach, you know, in kind of more of like the Theravadan, like progressive insight map, as we approach these dukkha jnanas, these, you know, knowledges of suffering, some of these stages of the path can be pretty intense. And so I wonder if, have you encountered that in your program working with teens? And is there anything kind of, have you had to navigate anybody having like a real challenging experience as they're starting to recognize some more of the nature of their mind and their awareness and who they are?
Yes, it's one of the reasons I mentioned that it's so important to me that we've done so much work to make sure that we're being as trauma informed as possible. It's not just we're recognizing how many of our students have trauma coming into the class, but we're recognizing that it can be destabilizing to have an experience where perhaps when you're going through the part of the curriculum where we're underlining that you are not your thoughts, which is actually really early on in the curriculum. For a student who's been really attached to believing I'm everything that I think, that can be momentarily quite destabilizing. And it's incredibly important in our curriculum that, and you heard this as I spoke earlier about how I approached the book as well, students the pace that students go is completely honored, whatever that is, including resistance. If a student is able to say, I'm not feeling going into a guided imagery today. As soon as I close my eyes, all I see are images of hardship from my home life right now. So, hey, no problem. What a gift that this class is allowing you to be self-aware enough to know that today is not the right day for you to do a guided imagery. So that's the kind of thing that's really supported in our classroom. Also, I want to underline that I do think a lot of people, when they hear that we're with the same set of teens for over 70 hours, they think, oh, that's a lot of meditation. But actually, our curriculum, it's not meditation heavy. Some would say that it's heavier on creating conscious community, being in relationship with each other in conscious and healthy ways, being able to speak to each other and listen to each other in ways that support this recognition of who we truly are, rather than just reinforce egoic patterns. Being able to have these contemplative technologies support our own growth and human evolution. So meditation and resting in our own being is an important part of the class, but it's certainly not a meditation class. It's one of the reasons I love the title of the class, which is Mindful Studies. It's for me, that just incorporates a lot.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's really inspiring to hear. And I'm just find myself wishing that I had that class available to me in high school. That would have saved me a whole lot of pain and suffering and life and relationships afterwards, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people actually make that comment, because I think we all wish that we'd had a little more support. And when I say we all, at this point, I'm referring to just adults in the world that if you're an adult in this world, you know, you've seen a lot of shit at this point. You know, we collectively have been through a lot. So to be able to recognize that if we had some of the supports that like the three of us on this call have at this point, when we're younger, we're able to see we probably would have made some different choices. And that, you know, that's not the same as having to go down a road of regret, or something bad happened, or something wrong happened, or we don't, you know, we can't trust life because there was this like wrong turn. It's just the recognition that some of us have really had to learn things the hard way. And it's nice to consider that we might be focusing on raising our young people to not have to have so much learned through. I always talk about some of my monastic experiences being like learning through throwing myself against a brick wall and getting really bloody, and then realizing like, oh, okay, I think I won't do that again, and then doing it again, and then realizing like, oh, okay, you know, it just, yeah, being able to recognize that perhaps we don't always have to learn things in the most painful way possible.
Yeah, I was working with a young man a couple years ago, and there was some trauma that was present very early on, very, very early on in his life. And he asked me, he said, is suffering necessary? And we had gone through a process, and this was sort of on the end of coming out of it. And I responded, I said, it's not necessary, it's just very popular. It's this thing that we're shown and it's passed down to us. I mean, that's in a lot of religious traditions as well. And on that note, I have another little passage from your book. I forgot to ask you before we started the call, is it okay that I'm reading little passages?
Oh, yeah, of course. Anything that speaks to you it's interesting for me to hear what again, there's a lot in it. So the places that you connect with or that light up for you for any particular reason, that's interesting for me to hear what that is.
Okay, wonderful. Well, this is from the chapter practice, fleshing out our conditioning. Knowing how to fully be with discomfort allows for openness. In openness, transformation is possible. Resistance to discomfort shuts us down. Avoidance makes us small. And then this is connected to that as well, just on the following page. Our heroes commonly do not describe waking up as a comfortable process. We can learn to accept this, even embrace it. In discomfort, there is often growth, a particular aliveness. Most of us are conditioned to go to great lengths to be comfortable at all times. Ask yourself, what is the cost of this?
Yeah, what would you say the cost has been for you in those times in your life where you've chosen comfort over what you might recognize as truth? Not that it's always dualistic, but just, yeah.
I find that a lot of the times, not all the times, but it leads to regret, shame, blame for looking back and going, all that I didn't give that. I didn't give that everything I could have. And then that's part of my practice, because I have this, as you talk about it in your book, this inner self-critic, this voice, and I sit with it and I go, okay, what can I glean? What's true? Like, because that's indicating something to me, and there's something there, and I feel that. And that's why I've just been wanting to give more and more of myself to the work, and yet not be self-flagellating about giving myself to the work too. Like, it doesn't have to be. But yeah, the cost is just creating more and more suffering for myself. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah,
And
sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I just want to circle back a little bit on something that you said earlier, Caverly, which seems to be like just in my face, in my heart, so apparent now, that I can't do my work and it just be like my work or my practice. Like this relationship to it just feels so in the world, and it feels so involved and fractal and holographic. Like, and I feel that so many times when I'm thinking of how I'll appear or whatever it is, and then I just get out of my way and I go and help someone or be of service or sweep the house, whatever it is. Then I don't know, what's coming to me is seeing how simple that is, when, because my mind, I'll go, I've got to figure it out and solve the whole world suffering today. It's like, come on,
Right.
man. Where's
Right.
that voice coming from? What's that all about? So I know there was kind of a few different places I went there, but yeah, I wanted to really highlight what I feel is so important with what you're bringing forward. And I know what David feels deeply passionate about, that there is no my work and then other work. It's all the same field of let's be in this together. And respect the different pathways that you spoke to as well. Of that doesn't, it's not like I'm looking for a reductionist, here's the way, this is the one way. There's many different pathways and many different places that we can come into deeper resonance and harmony with each other by facing the traumas, by facing the really the parts where you said, you said avoidance makes us small. That's the cost too. I've avoided and then felt small and then felt, who am I to share this, or all of these things. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well said, well described. It's one thing that I put a lot of attention on in the book was being able to create a map of sorts. Like I really wanted someone to be able to say, like, I would like conscious community and I want a personal practice, but I want to know that the community I'm in relationship with has shared language and that there's a commitment to some kind of collective practice, so that we're, to reference the subtitle of the book, so that we're realizing freedom together. And I wanted it to, not every part of the map will speak to every community, but in fact, when I first wrote the proposal, I wrote the proposal with the intention to write a book for collectives. So whatever collective wanted to go through the book together could do so. And it's actually, I don't think sounds true, would mind me saying that my editor was pretty much like, yeah, we're not going to do that, because then we're only selling books to like collect it. You know, like we would sell a lot more books if you sold to individuals as well as communities. And you know, I thought, fair point. You know, my husband's a good example of someone he's going to read the book on his own, but he's not going to actually create a group of people to go through the process of the book with. And I realized that I didn't want the book, I'm being kind of tongue in cheek about Sounds True's guidance, but I really felt like it was pretty good feedback, because it made it even more open to supporting people wherever they are. And they might not, like I said, want to move through it collectively. But this idea that it's not like it's a book where you read it and then there's some sort of book club that can form later. The idea that it's a book that's meant for people to move through together is something that really appealed to me. And my dear friend Rashid Hughes, who is a meditation teacher in the Washington, DC area, and I are forming a book collective that will support folks in experiencing this journey collectively together. And I'm pretty jazzed to see what comes up in that context. I'm already working with other groups that are sort of forming around the book, but to have Rashid as a co-facilitator, I think is going to be a really rich and dynamic experience. But I look forward to hearing from groups that are forming, maybe like the ones that you all are talking about, like to hear like what happens for the group if there's this sort of shared container, shared context, shared tools. How does this map support realizing freedom together in various communities? And actually, in my opinion, like the more diverse it gets, the more exciting it'll be, whether it's like a Baptist church group and a Buddhist Sangha. And I mean, I'm really interested. I very intentionally don't frame this book as a Buddhist book, even though I reference, of course, a lot from my own Zen roots. And I talk about the kinds of experiences that people who have come to practice with me from the insight tradition often say they're noticing or sometimes struggling with.
Mm-hmm. Well,
in other words, I don't hide my own background, but it is nice to see folks coming that are from pretty diverse backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I spoke to David just earlier today. We were actually discussing this very thing, which is reading through this and doing the practices together in the creation that we have. So are you sold on it?
I was just thinking as you were sharing, Caverly, actually, as we are kind of just in this very like the birth phase of creating an online group and inviting people into it. And we were just basically discussing earlier, is like, oh wow, Facebook groups, they usually have like rules and regulations. Like, what do we do with that? What is the operating system? What is the software that our community runs on? And it can be so interesting to experiment with. It's like, okay, here someone has open sourced this mindful community operating system. that we could try out, and it sounds like, you know, everybody obviously modifies it to be applicable to the group of people that actually shows up for that. But how wonderful to not have to start with, you know, from the ground up, you know, throwing ourselves against the brick wall, finding out the hard way. It's not easy to have a mindful, conscious, intentional community
No.
when stuff comes up. So thank you for
Yeah,
giving
no, thank you.
some roadmaps.
No, I really hope you'll keep me posted. I'll be really interested
Absolutely.
to kind of see what develops and what forms. And, you know, I've only ever lived in conscious community to some degree. In other words, I went straight from, I mean, as conscious as my college experience was, that's, you know, kind of a dicey way,
At
but,
least
you know,
conscious.
yeah. I went straight from college to working at this community for people with developmental disabilities, to living as a potter in an artist community, to being in a monastic community, and then basically to creating community. I mean, Peace in Schools has become the community that I'm often working inside. And then when I'm not working inside Peace in Schools, I'm leading retreats and creating community through the different practice offerings that I'm part of, and that I put out into the world. So yeah, it's a great, it's a gift to recognize that we don't have to do this alone, that we can lean into each other's learnings and trade notes and have, you know, shared manuals, and also you know, be transparent with each other about our hardships as we go about creating conscious communities, so that as you reflect back, we're not kind of throwing ourselves against the same walls, you know, needlessly.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I have one more little passage from your book, maybe my favorite one. It's hard to say favorite because just so full of richness, but I want to share this one, and it's in the introduction, and you share, at the end of the day, my mission is simple: live in a world where we all experience our inherent belonging, our inherent wholeness, and our inherent freedom, where the reality of oneness is fully expressed in the world we create. I believe that true and lasting world change depends on knowing ourselves in the absolute sense. This book focuses on this knowing and how to move through the world from this knowing, to move through the world recognizing the truth of our shared being, while not ignoring all that can appear to get in the way within our relative world, our families, our communities, our society, the relative world of our personal and collective conditioning. True change occurs not just when we know who we truly are or have a direct experience of our shared being, but when we act in the world on behalf of this truth, this knowing.
I'm so glad to learn that resonated with you.
Yeah. It's like, it's right there. That's like that. I read that to David earlier. He's like, yeah, that's it. Like, that's it. That's what we're doing. That's what we're focusing on.
It's so funny to hear it back to me, because I actually did just read a passage of the introduction the other day out loud, and I realized that was just the other day was the first time I realized that that there's a typo in it, because it, you know, it says my mission is simple, and it should say to live in the world, right? I don't know. At least that's how it seemed when I said it out loud the other day, and then when I hear it back from you now, I think it's missing the word to, but it doesn't matter because it still spoke to you, even if it's missing a word. And that's lovely. I tell you, the copy editing phase, I mean, it sounds like you've written a book as well, but the copy editing phase was such a bear. And, you know, at one point that word was there, and who knows when it got dropped, but it is actually quite heartwarming to hear that the message has no trouble getting through to you, even if a word is dropped.
Yeah, it had no trouble to getting through to me. I didn't
Yeah.
even recognize that. And yeah, I mean, if there's a meditation practice, I did a self-publishing, and I tried, and I had other people edit it too, to get all the typos out. And it's just, I think there was one in the final edition that I noticed, and then I reprinted it like 4 or 5 times after noticing others. And yeah, that's a practice of patience. I'm going to send you a copy of
I love
my
it. Thank you. I would love to
Well,
see it. That would
yeah.
be great. That would be great.
Mm.
Well, I'm so glad we'll keep in touch then as you
Yeah.
all do what you're doing, and I'd love to support it in any way I can. The world benefits from conscious community. So what you're brewing up sounds stimulating and engaging and exciting and heartwarming.
Mm. Igualmente. Spanish for likewise.
Thank you so much, Caverly. Yeah, it's just
Yeah,
been
thank you.
meeting you, connecting with you today, and thank you for just being a part of this community that we are all co-creating globally. You know, what a gift that we have of technology, that we are able to co-create this global collective and share best practices with one another and support one another along the way of creating our fractal little communities within the greater whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And if it interests you, just as you're in this journey to meet up in person, and I'm one of my favorite things these days is leading retreats, and I can tell you two would really love being in the container that gets created in the retreats that I offer. So if you ever want to come, just like check that out, please. Yeah. And actually, for any of the listeners, my website is just so simple, caverlymorgan.org.
Yeah, that's the last question I was going to ask, if there's any events or retreats in particular that are coming up that you wanted to say a few words about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know when you'll air this, but if the April retreat at Esalen, the hot springs in California, hasn't happened yet, it's just really sacred space, and I'm looking forward to the community that's gathering around that retreat. And then this summer I have a retreat on Whidbey Island at the Whidbey Island Institute, really special retreat center that is very conscious of what they do on the land. And so it's not a retreat center where there's like a whole bunch of different things, happening on the property, although that can be beautiful and exciting in its own way in some properties. But this property is quite special to me because it's very, very committed. The vision mission of the center itself strongly aligns with my work. And so I'm looking forward to that one in Whidbey Island in the Pacific Northwest. And then I'm going to be leading a retreat with Michelle Cassandra Johnson, author of Skill in Action. She wrote the foreword. As yogis, you probably know her work. Lovely, lovely person who is, she is her Finding Refuge is her second book. And then there's another one that comes out in April. And for some reason in this moment, I'm drawing a blank on the title, but she's just a dear friend, and we're going to be leading something at Kripalu. And then I lead a New Year's retreat every year, and I actually haven't even picked the location. Maybe I'll do it in Costa Rica.
Yeah. Wow. Well, so brilliant. Yeah. Thank you to my Dharma brother, and thank you to my Dharma sister.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Dharma friends.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. And this will be up sometime in March, so it'll be up before
Great.
retreat, and I'll link up your website and everything in the show notes for everyone to be able to dive deeper should they wish. Thank you for who you are and the work that you do, and just so grateful.
Thank you. Thank you both for being.
Thank you so much, Caverly.
Bye.
Bye-bye.